This slideshow focuses on the black-white binary in relationship to rock music and rock film. So we'll explain what the black-white binary is, and we'll talk a little bit about the idea of representation in film. Maybe you could call it representation in film. We'll say more as our slideshow continues. Representation is a key term in mass media studies and cultural studies. And the idea of representation is that photography represents a pre-existing truth. Film represents a pre-existing truth. So that's kind of a traditional way of understanding documentary photography, is that when we take a picture, it's worth 1,000 words because it has more accuracy. And so based on that assumption, early on in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when we did critical analysis of representation, we'd think about how much accuracy or distortion of truth is present in any particular visual spectacle. Does that visual spectacle present the truth accurately, or does it distort the truth? And behind that method is an assumption that the truth is already there, so your visual tools simply present it as it was or distort it from what it was. So from my standpoint, this way of understanding representation is just a little simplistic. It is good. Good work can be done because sometimes there is distortion of truth, so to speak, in documentary or feature film. But I think we want to think of the process of representation as being more central to the meaning, that there may not be a meaning there, a pre-existing truth, until we do the act of interpretation. So anyway, let's think about that idea of representation, the idea that the photography is presenting something that's already there, and maybe there is some way to present it with accuracy and fidelity to human experience, or to distort it in a way that is not providing us with insight. We'll just briefly mention the term agency here because it's a term that just refers to, for marginalized people especially, how much power or access does a marginalized person or group have in determining how they're represented in a journalistic context. So let's apply that to women in rock. If you talk to women in rock, do they feel like they have control over their image? If we're talking about Lady Gaga, if we're talking about Taylor Swift, do they feel like they have sufficient agency, opportunity to control their image that allow them to create and distribute representations of their experience that they feel are accurate? Something to think about in relation to current day stars as well as stars of other eras. One other sociological term I think is helpful for this discussion is construction of difference. So this phrase comes from sociology, and it just means that we, as a part of our social interaction, often use variables about and personal characteristics to think about categories and even to think about stereotypes. So which particular differences matter in a given society? I think for America, perhaps racial differences matter, gender differences matter. Do religious differences matter as much? Maybe, maybe not. I think some societies put more emphasis on religious differences. But anyway, the idea behind the construction of difference is that in every society, there are certain attributes among individuals and groups that are considered to be powerful attributes that make you in the in group or the out group. But it really varies somewhat with each society which attributes are considered to determine in group or out group. So that's a way of thinking that can be helpful as we consider how film characters are drawn and presented. Let's get to the key point for this slide, which is the black-white binary. A very common notion that African Americans and whites have distinctive and contrasting characteristics. And this is a very common belief, unfortunately, that I used to say in my slideshows that is fading, that we no longer have this kind of stark opposition between what we assume black personhood is and what we assume white personhood is. But I don't know if it's disappearing as fast as I would like to think it is. I think that we are still at a point where we consider, many of us in an American social context, that African Americans and whites have distinctive characteristics, different types of people, so to speak, that might even be considered as opposites. So I think in music industry, that has certainly been the case, where there has been separate marketing strategies for black artists and white artists. And there hasn't been as much integration in those markets as one would hope. So I think as we study these materials in the history of rock and roll, think about the presence or absence of black performers, because certainly at the beginning of rock, there were significant black performers such as Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jimi Hendrix, Sly and the Family Stone, Bo Diddley, Muddy Waters. These were household names in their day. But has rock as a genre continued to include black performers? And we can always ask the question of why. Why do people's music choices as an audience or a musician, why are they influenced by racial scripts? These are things that are well worth thinking about. This slide is just a brief reminder that some of the most common recent experiences we have reinforced the black-white binary. I mean, certainly recent presidential politics, and the picture there is meant to emphasize that it seems there is a binary in American presidential politics, a black-white binary, where white voters certainly support Trump more than black voters by a very large percentage. And on the right, it it's a still from Black Jeopardy, and just the fact that Saturday Night Live produces a segment called Black Jeopardy, where again just the characteristics of the people goes according to a social script, the ways that we assume that black personhood and linguistics are executed, all of that stuff is there in Black Jeopardy, even if you happen to be meeting Tom Hanks. So again, just there's a lot that reinforces the black-white binary. I want us to think about, does rock and roll as a cultural expression also reinforce that black-white binary? And are there historical trends where there's more reinforcement perhaps at some points and less at other points? Let's think about that question as we look at the films coming up in week 2. And this is where we leave each other as we finish up this slideshow. On the black-white binary in rock and roll, is the central role of black musicians as inventors of rock and roll. Is that central role known? Is it well known? Do we celebrate that role? Do we compensate the families of the musicians that helped to invent rock and roll? So that's one really powerful question. If rock and roll is thought to be a kind of a genius art form that was developed largely in the USA, it makes a difference to your ethnic group's standing if you are known to produce intellectual objects of great wealth, of great worth, I should say. I want us to look also at that illustration in the lower left, where there's a list of prominent rock bands. Are any of those rock bands including black musicians in them? And then the question becomes, why are black musicians so absent from the ways that we normally understand rock and roll in the 21st century? And what do we make of that? I'll leave you with that question as we begin our work for this week, and maybe it's something that you can bring up when you have your discussions. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.